How's everyone doing today? Welcome back into the GSMC Chip Shot Football Podcast brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host, Manny Maradiege, and on today's show, on top of two stories I wanted to talk about, I wanted to bring up a couple of what-if scenarios, a couple of situations that if they went in one direction, it could have changed my whole viewpoint on it and could have ended up very differently around the NFL and just how people envision it nowadays. So, on top of those two what if scenarios to start the show, on today's episode, live on May the 2nd, we're going to be talking about how the Las Vegas Raiders ended up with one of the most talented guys in the draft, Brock Bowers, falling to them at 13. I'm going to react to that and just sort of how all of it broke down on draft day. Then, to close out the show, Steelers general manager Omar Khan addressed the trade rumors around Brandon Ayuk, Courtland Sutton, Deebo Samuel. He talked about it all on the Pat McAfee show, and I'm going to come on here and discuss it and see which outcome seems more likely for the Pittsburgh Steelers once the NFL season starts in later this year in a few months. So all of that is coming up on today's episode. Make sure to like, follow, and subscribe to the show. And as always, before I start on the first segment, a reminder to you guys, if you have any questions or comments during today's live show, to use the tip and donations link you see on your screen, gsmcpodcast.net. Using this link, I'm able to see your question in my chat box. I can read it on air and get your guys' perspective on anything I say or on either of the topics on today's show. It's a lot more interactive, and it's a massive help for the show as well as all the other shows across the network. So if you guys would, with any of your questions or comments, use the tip and donations link, gsmcpodcast.net. Saying that, the first topic on today's show, one of the what-if scenarios, all starts from this report that recently came out from the Atlanta Falcons and them trying to trade back into the first round after their very surprising selection of Michael Penix. Of course, if, like most people, you watched the draft, you saw at pick number 8, the Atlanta Falcons surprised everybody and threw everyone's draft plan out the window by selecting Michael Penix. Of course, they signed Kirk Cousins to that massive deal, $180 million, $100 million guaranteed. So to take a quarterback here didn't make too much sense for me. And my mindset on this, before this report came out, was that this was the Atlanta Falcons' initial plan going into the draft, thinking that they're going to get a quarterback and forget about the defense. We'll address that later. I didn't think that was the right mindset to attack this draft with, but now with this report coming out, it sort of swayed me in a little bit, kind of holding off on my feelings around drafting a quarterback because I was really against it, but now I can sort of understand where they're coming from. To talk more about the report in specifics, it was reported by Steve Wyche of the NFL Network that Atlanta was actually targeting UCLA pass rusher Laiatu Latu, targeting him in the middle part of the draft, actually around where he went at 15. The first defensive player selected, right about the midpoint of the first round. That's the area where the Atlanta Falcons were targeting to trade back into the first round. And you look at that, you consider all your options. The teams in and around there, the Seahawks, the Colts who selected Laiatu Latu, and at 14 you had the New Orleans Saints, all viable options to trade with. I guess not the Saints, same division. That, thinking about it now, wouldn't be too likely. But you had the Colts who ended up drafting Laiatu Latu, and knowing Chris Ballard and the kind of general manager that he is, he really values the picks, accumulating them, kind of preparing for future drafts, having that ammunition in his back pocket to work with, maybe make deals with later on. He is one of the most notorious GMs for gathering draft picks, and that seems like a very reasonable opportunity for them to trade up with. But ultimately, it didn't end up working out for the Falcons. They only had that one pick in the first round, being Michael Penix, and with that, I like the idea now that I'm seeing it. The reports are coming in They reportedly were going to offer a few of their day 2 picks. They had two third-round picks available in that second day of the draft. They could have offered their second-round pick as well. But again, nothing was really confirmed as to what specifically they offered or what maybe the Colts rejected or any of those other teams. But it was reasonable for them to trade back to target that defensive player in the end. And what's even more fascinating to me around the Falcons and them trying to trade back into the first round, there was also some interest with the New York Jets at number 10 from the Atlanta Falcons. If you guys are aware, the New York Jets had a draft documentary on YouTube called Flight 24, and it's their NFL draft documentary, like I mentioned. And on there, I've seen a few clips from this documentary. I haven't actually watched the whole thing, but I've seen a few clips of just relating to the draft and the Jets in relation to their discussions and how sort of everything breaks down with them trying to trade and make these decisions. One of them I saw was completely different from this situation when they were trying to trade up to draft Malachi Corley in the later rounds, actually considering Roman Wilson, who ended up going to the Steelers, and how all of that broke down, them reaching out to a few teams, getting a lot of no's back, but then finally the Carolina Panthers deciding to trade up with them. It's pretty interesting seeing those conversations that, on draft night, if you're watching ESPN, ABC, whatever you watch the draft through, to see this documentary and not only look at them in their draft room and seeing their reactions, dapping each other up, celebrating. You could actually hear them in the documentary and how it all goes down, which I thought was super interesting. And in those conversations, you can see, because they have the subtitles on these clips going around the internet, that there's a moment in there where General Manager Joe Douglas gets off the phone with the Atlanta Falcons, apparently, and his quote from that moment was, they want to come back up to 10, so they want number 8 and number 10, is what General Manager Joe Douglas said, obviously referring to the Atlanta Falcons. And that is even more fascinating to me because you saw that number 10 pick. It was originally traded over to the Minnesota Vikings. I was drawing a blank there for a second, but the Vikings moved up there because, ironically, of the move that the Atlanta Falcons made. And this is where the whole what-if scenario kind of comes into mind. What if the Atlanta Falcons, instead of going quarterback first, instead of really pushing all their chips onto Michael Penix and anticipating that he becomes their long-term quarterback after Kirk, having one of the most luxurious insurance policies there at the quarterback position, what if instead of going quarterback at number 8, they went defensive player first, and then they tried to trade back into the first round for a quarterback? I think this would have all flipped on its head if they decided to go that route. If they decided to go according to the plan, you see all these mock drafts and everybody projecting their picks. Everybody had a defensive player penciled in for the Atlanta Falcons, at number 8. That was the plan. That was the anticipation. And I think if it broke down that way, you wouldn't have seen this whole chain reaction of the Vikings, the Broncos, really almost panicking after Michael Penix was taken at number 8. You heard Sean Payton, or at least I heard Sean Payton during the draft in interviews afterwards saying once Penix went at number 8, everybody was kind of taken by surprise, and it threw everybody into a shock because the Broncos obviously need a quarterback. The Vikings were targeting JJ, but once one of them went earlier than they'd expect, everybody starts to hit the red button, so to say, and start trying to figure out their options to ensure that they get their guy, their number 1 prospect on their board. And I just think if the Falcons would have went defensive player first, all these other teams would have relaxed, and I think a trade with the New York Jets would have become a lot more likely because the Vikings wouldn't have felt so much pressure to move up just one more spot after the Bears selected Rome Odunze to ensure that they got J.J. McCarthy. They could have stayed at 11. You're thinking, what's the big deal? One pick. you couldn't have waited one pick to select JJ and not trade up. Well, there has been instances, like Sean Payton would know, he was a pick away from selecting Patrick Mahomes. The Chiefs traded up, jumped him one pick away from him selecting Patrick Mahomes. The Chiefs jumped on top, and they ended up taking Patrick Mahomes. The rest is history. So, you could wait those extra 4 minutes, 3 minutes until you see that the pick is in at the bottom of the screen. But in that time, a trade could be worked out, and you never know what could happen. So, ironically, with the Falcons deciding to take a quarterback first, I think it just ruined their whole big plan, if this was the initial plan going into the draft, of trading back into the first round, because they threw everybody into a panic, and because of that, they weren't able to double dip, per se, in the first round and get two players, which, if they ended up getting a defensive player at 8, and then I saw that they traded back with the Jets, with the Colts, or whoever in the first round, and still got Michael Penix, instead of me coming on here and saying why I wasn't a big fan of this move, I probably would have given it, as well as other people, I'm sure, would have given their draft grade or their analysis of their draft. They probably would have been one of the best drafts, one of the best first rounds of anybody in the NFL. I truly believe that. Looking around the internet and seeing these guys evaluate the drafts, a lot of people had the Falcons last because of this questionable move. But if they would have flipped it, went defensive player first, I think everybody would have been more relaxed. They might have entertained these trade talks with the Falcons, and I'm sure a lot of people, if they drafted, say, Dallas Turner at 8 and then Michael Penix at 10, or potentially 14 or 15 if he was still there, a lot of people you would see have the Atlanta Falcons first round graded as an A, an A+. I couldn't see it anything less than that. So the way it all planned out, I just think they decided on the order of it the wrong way. I like the idea of double dipping and going for two players in there, because you address your major need, and then you get that insurance policy that I wouldn't have had any problems with if they just addressed their main need. Of course, after, in the later rounds, they, I think, had four picks in a row where they selected defensive players. So, trying to address it more so in quantity rather than quality. But I just think they got the order wrong. I like the plan. If this was the initial plan, trying to get quarterback and defensive player, I love that. But I think they got the order wrong, and because they did, it forced everybody into their shell and hide away from them trading back into the first round. And because they all wanted to get their guys, it put them all in this state of panic, not really wanting to risk too much. And the Broncos take Bo Nix. The Vikings trade up one pick and take J.J. McCarthy. And then you're left with your hands empty at the end of the day in the first round in trying to draft a defensive player. Again, it would have definitely swayed my view on this whole situation with Michael Penix and him going to the Falcons. No problem with Penix. Again, he's going to be a great player, I think. I just don't see him fitting in right away. While he's being 24 years old, I think this could have been right away a kickstart into the league, taking over a team, making it his own. He's going to have to wait a year or two with the Atlanta Falcons because I anticipate Kirk being great in the regular season. Because of that, we're not really going to see Michael Penix for a while is the anticipation as of now, and I'm kind of disappointed with that because I'm a big fan of him, but it is what it is now. A massive what if that would have really flipped this entire draft on its head if the Falcons would have double dipped like that, but the scenario is now what it is. The Falcons will go on with Michael Penix, and we're just going to have to see how it turns out. Definitely rooting for them, for the Falcons and Michael Penix, just because they haven't really had a lot of success recently, but they feel like this is the best route to that, and we're just going to have to take their word for it now, in all honesty. But in the meantime, we're going to move on with the show. A lot more coming up on today's episode. I mentioned the what-if scenarios. We're going to go into the second one, this time around the Houston Texans and the Cleveland Browns. Remember that trade they made with Deshaun Watson? Well, that is finally finalized, and it is the time where now the Cleveland Browns can have a first-round pick again, but we're going to analyze how each team has ended up after that trade 3 years ago. Stay tuned to find out what the Houston Texans got out of the trade and what the Cleveland Browns got as well. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back after this break.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on their fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient. Hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing. Sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown. Get in my way and to be put down. It ain't replaced all this my sound. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the news it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk with...
Welcome back to the GSMC Chip Shot Football Podcast. To jump now into the second segment around the trade scenario that happened a while ago, 3 years ago now, with the Houston Texans and the Cleveland Browns around Deshaun Watson. I'm sure if you can go back that far 3 years ago, I don't think anybody would have imagined at all what this trade would have turned out like it has right now. The Houston Texans and the Cleveland Browns back then in 2021, made that trade for Deshaun Watson with the whole, sexual misconduct being going on, the case going on with Deshaun Watson back then. Later, he was suspended for violating the NFL's personal conduct policy and the relationship that Deshaun Watson had going in with the Houston Texans. It all seemed a bit odd. I don't think anybody would have thought that this whole relationship would be fixed in the end. So because of that, there was a lot of trade talks with him. It really came down to the Cleveland Browns and the Atlanta Falcons at the time, and it looked like, Deshaun Watson with his roots in Atlanta, it seemed like that was going to be the destination for him, but he ended up going to the Cleveland Browns, and even before he had a snap played in the NFL with the Cleveland Browns, he and the Browns agreed to a massive 5-year, $230 million deal. All of that guaranteed, being the highest amount of money guaranteed to an NFL player in NFL history. You look at the trade, there was a lot of interchangeable pieces that went into it. The Browns obviously got Deshaun Watson and a pick or two, but in return, the Houston Texans got a lot back. As you see on your screen, I will break it down, but initially when it was announced, the Browns gave the Houston Texans a 2022 first-round pick and a fourth-round pick, a first-round pick, and a third-round pick in 2023, and a first-round pick and fourth-round pick in 2024. A total of 6 picks went to the Houston Texans for Deshaun Watson. And now, after all those years, 3 years, 4 years, the Cleveland Browns will finally have a first-round pick of their own next season in 2025. But looking at that in the moment, you could never have imagined what the Houston Texans will be now. From that point, to completely rebuild this team through essentially all of those draft picks to where they are now on the verge, or probably already as Super Bowl contenders, at least in my eyes, I'm sure in a lot of people's eyes. It's pretty remarkable what they did with these picks, just going through them in more detail year by year. In 2022, like I mentioned, they received pick number 13 and 104 from the Cleveland Browns, which they turned into one of their starting guards, Kenyon Green with the 13th pick that they actually traded for the 15th overall pick, as well as 3 others in 2022. And they used those 3 other picks from the Philadelphia Eagles in that trade in 2022 to acquire their current wide receiver, John Mechie. They used a later pick to draft their linebacker, Christian Harris. And to round it off, they also drafted Thomas Booker and their starting running back for that time being Dameon Pierce. A pretty good haul in 2022, but that's only the start of this whole trade process that went down with the Houston Texans and the Browns. Moving on to 2023, they received pick number 12 and 73 from the Cleveland Browns, and with the 12th overall pick, that was traded to the Arizona Cardinals along with the Houston Texans' 33rd overall pick and this year's first round pick. Number 27 ended up being Darius Robinson. If you recall from last week, that was the second pick the Cardinals had in the first round, originally belonging to the Houston Texans. Now the Cardinals used it to draft Darius Robinson. But with that number 3 overall pick that they acquired from their trade with the Arizona Cardinals, they obviously drafted Will Anderson, the Defensive Rookie of the Year this past year. And they also received pick number 105 from the Arizona Cardinals, which they ended up getting defensive back Kalen Bullock through a trade as well. And to round it off with pick number 73 that they had from the Cleveland Browns as well in that trade for Deshaun Watson, they traded that to the Los Angeles Rams to acquire pick 161 in 2023 and move up a few spots for the 69th overall pick, which ended up being their current star wide receiver Tank Dell, on the way to a very impressive breakthrough season before he injured his ankle. But again, they had another bona fide starter now picked in that draft from one of the picks they acquired from the Cleveland Browns. And then finally this year, they still had pick number 23 and pick number 123 from the Cleveland Browns. And I'm sure if you follow the draft, you know that pick number 23 was traded to the Vikings. They used that pick to move up to draft Dallas Turner in that trade with the Jaguars. But essentially in this year's draft, with those picks and going through all the trades, they were able to acquire Kamari Lassiter, the defensive back, Jamal Hill at pick 188, and Minnesota's second-round pick in 2025 as well now belongs to the Houston Texans. So a massive haul that they got from all these picks from the Cleveland Browns. They also drafted Cade Stover as well with a trade with the Philadelphia Eagles for that 123rd overall pick. They were able to draft Cade Stover as well. So you look at that and you're thinking you have about 6 to 7 players that you acquired there from just these draft picks that you turned into unquestionable starters for your team. And on the other side, you have Deshaun Watson, at the time, one of the best quarterbacks in the league. You know, during his time in Houston, a lot of the narrative was that he is really just carrying the team. The Houston Texans didn't do much to supply him with the necessary help that he needed. So the relationship didn't really work out, and he was looking for a trade, landed with the Cleveland Browns. And at the time, it might not have looked great with the pieces that they had around him. But now you look at this Cleveland Browns team and what they gave up to acquire Deshaun Watson. It's looking not too bad for Deshaun Watson. You know, I'm trying to find the words to phrase it just because looking at this Browns team now and how loaded they seem to be with that defense, arguably a top 3 defense. You know, you have Chubb in your backfield. You have David Njoku, who has really broken out this past season, especially heading into the playoffs. You have Amari Cooper. That offensive line is very good. You acquired Jerry Jeudy as well. And then you look at Deshaun Watson, and it just hasn't really clicked in his 2 full seasons that he's been there. He's only been able to play 12 games, has a 60% completion percentage, has only thrown for 2,200 yards, 14 touchdowns, and 9 interceptions. Doesn't really match up with paying him $230 million guaranteed, and also you know, being that starter for this Cleveland Browns and trading so much of your equity in draft to the Houston Texans, comparing them and bringing up this what if scenario. What if this trade never really happened? What if you went to the Atlanta Falcons and their current quarterback would have been Deshaun Watson? How would that have turned out? Where would the Cleveland Browns be? I know they obviously needed a quarterback at that time. They were in dire need of one. And Deshaun Watson, you can't predict the future. And in hindsight, this looks very lopsided, obviously, as you can see on your screen. But at the time, it's hard to really crucify the Browns for making this trade. Desperation can cause you to make trades like this. And you could have never predicted the Houston Texans to be in this position. But credit goes to the Houston Texans for making this move and really taking that jump to trade away their franchise, essentially. He was the face of the Houston Texans. And to go from Davis Mills being your starting quarterback and just everybody having no expectations for this Houston Texans team, all the issues they had in their front office, their general manager, they're figuring out their coaching situation. You bring in a rookie in DeMeco Ryan, and then you draft CJ Stroud as well, another rookie, putting a lot on his plate, a lot of expectations to turn around in 3 years, 4 years like it has right now. I can't think of another full rebuild situation like the Houston Texans that turned around this quickly, and it all could have been a lot different if the Texans decided, we're going to stick with Deshaun Watson as the safe option, and we're just going to live with him carrying us these next few years. That's a safe option. Credit goes again to the Texans for making that jump, not being overly safe with what they do. You look at them in free agency as well, being overly aggressive and going out and trading for Joe Mixon, acquiring Danielle Hunter, and just going out even as well trading for Stephon Diggs, making that sort of blockbuster trade. Nick Caserio and DeMeco Ryans have had a great mindset in trying to rebuild this team. It's that kind of mindset that, gets these teams to one year they're bottom of the division, bottom of the conference, to now remarkably turning into this Super Bowl contending team. A lot of credit, of course, goes to CJ Stroud as well. Nobody could have predicted him having the kind of season that he did. As a number 2 overall pick, even with that, it's still hard to tell with these quarterbacks. You look at the 2021 draft, even the 2022 draft, a lot of those guys just haven't panned out. To have struck gold like you did with CJ Stroud, that also plays into it. And it's just crazy to think about now, just one decision, how that could have altered all of this for the Texans and the Browns. But overall, it just hasn't been good enough sticking with the Cleveland Browns from Deshaun Watson. And now at this point, because of you comparing it to the Houston Texans and just weighing out the rewards that the Texans got from making this trade compared to the Browns, it looks very lopsided, and I believe it is. But I think there's still time for Deshaun Watson to kind of right the ship a little bit. It definitely hasn't been what anybody thought it could be, but they have the weapons there. They have everything that he needs. Now this year, you're getting Nick Chubb back healthy, hopefully, off of that knee injury. You have David Njoku kind of stepping out of his shell and becoming a great tight end. Amari Cooper can still give you something. You bring him some help with Jerry Jeudy. Offensive line is great. Defense is, like I said, top 3 with a generational player like Myles Garrett. They have everything in an AFC conference where you need all of these things to compete. All you really need, most of all, is the quarterback, and Deshaun Watson is definitely not, done. He's not washed up. It's not like there's no hope for him, but I think now you're getting to the point, this breaking point with the Browns, where everybody's hyping up the Texans as a constant reminder of this trade and how lopsided it is. It's going to come to a point where if Deshaun doesn't give you more than what he is doing, it's going to get very loud in Cleveland with those fans wanting to have success with the team that they have. It's going to get very loud, and it's going to get very negative to a point with Deshaun Watson if he doesn't change this around. But I believe that he can do it. He's on a massive contract, so that also gets a lot of people talking about how your play is on the field. Currently, he has a salary cap number of almost $64 million for the Browns. The Browns are reportedly likely to try and rework that, obviously, but, all of that plays into more pressure, I guess I would say, for Deshaun Watson this coming year because of this trade and now it finally being done with. The Browns can move on. People look at this, analyze this, and right now it looks bad, but definitely the Browns can do something to try and get the most out of Deshaun Watson for what they're paying him and for what they gave up in the end. It's going to be interesting to see how that plays out starting this year in 2024. But in the meantime, we will move on and continue on with today's show. More on the Raiders and the draft talk, like I mentioned before. Sticking with the Raiders, how they ended up landing on Brock Bowers. How did one of the most talented guys in the NFL draft land all the way to 13 into the lap of the Las Vegas Raiders? I'll tell you more on that situation and just my reaction to it all, breaking down as it did after the break. So stick around because you're listening to the GSMC Chip Shot Football Podcast.
Out having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube. Absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube to catch one of your new favorite shows, like the GSMC College Football Podcast, Chip Shot Football Podcast, Hoops and Heels Women's Sports Podcast, GSMC Basketball Podcast, and so many more. Check it out for yourself. GSMC Sports Network, now available on YouTube absolutely free. Search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube right now.
Jumping back into the show, into the third segment of the draft, and talking more a little bit here on some of the teams that I haven't really brought up as of yet. The Las Vegas Raiders were one of those teams in the quarterback conversations. At pick 13, it was always going to be tough for them to go up and try and trade up for a Jaden Daniels, who seemed to be the favorite because of his connection with Antonio Pierce and recruiting him to Arizona State. There was a relationship there already, but again, like most people would have said, I was of the mindset that I wouldn't gamble away the future by trading them a boatload of first-round picks, maybe some of your players that you have, just to move up for a quarterback that wouldn't have the best supporting cast around them. So the Las Vegas Raiders decided to stay put at 13, and just seeing how the board fell with Michael Penix going earlier and that chain reaction that I talked about earlier in the show kind of breaking down as it did, they decided not to trade up, stay put at 13, and they ended up having Brock Bowers just sitting there for the taking. And I saw a lot of people not really be pleased with this pick, be confused by it, because they could have easily gone corner. Quinyon Mitchell was sitting right there. He was highly touted as the best corner, one of the best defensive players overall in this draft, and it seemed like that could have been a very good pick. That was the quote-unquote ideal pick for the value and everything like that, but they took Brock Bowers. They went with the best player available, and all these trade rumors and stuff like that were sort of put to rest as their pick got closer and closer. One thing that came out was that from ESPN's Jeremy Fowler that reported on this whole situation about a trade coming from a Las Vegas Raiders source that said everything else was smoke and mirrors. We weren't going to reach or overpay for a quarterback. It was never a worry and nothing frantic. So just stating back to the fact that the Raiders around those trade talks almost using it as a decoy just to sort of ruffle some feathers up there in the draft. Hopefully for them, ideally it would have worked out. Maybe they say they're going to trade up and it just affected how all these other teams went about their business. But it just seemed like this source says from the Las Vegas Raiders that it was all just smoke and mirrors. They weren't really thinking about doing it, but it does play in contrast to what Tom Telesco said, their general manager for the Las Vegas Raiders, mentioning that they did explore a trade prior to the draft. He claimed that he didn't pursue a trade up particularly very hard in that first round. They were exploring it, like the report said, but it never really developed into anything serious. And he went on in his press conference for day 2 of the NFL draft, and he went on to say, on the quarterback selections potentially in the later rounds, he said, on the third day, no, really not the second day either. First day, yes, but not after that. If we felt there was a quarterback out there that was better than what we had or could potentially be better, certainly we would have done something about it, but it didn't line up. Raiders will now essentially just go with Gardner Minshew and Aiden O'Connell as their quarterbacks heading into the season. That's the expected outcome unless they, sign somebody in free agency or try to trade for somebody else. That seems to be their 2 starters. I'm probably leaning towards Gardner Minshew being their starter, but with all the trade talks and everything, I think it just left everybody very underwhelmed that the Raiders didn't do anything, just sort of saw all the top quarterbacks be picked off one by one, and people were just left very surprised with their very tame attitude towards it. But in contrast to that, I think they did the right thing, not overdoing it potentially for someone that could work out. I didn't really like that mindset, and they went with a safer option, Brock Bowers, like I mentioned, which is the main topic about this whole idea. Now you shift your attention to Brock Bowers and you get over not drafting a quarterback, and you still have one of the most talented players on offense just in general in this draft. I thought he was for sure going top 10. I was a little surprised when the Jets, I know they traded back to 11, but I was still pretty surprised when they took an offensive tackle. I know that was another favorite position for the Jets to draft, protection for the future, more protection for Aaron Rodgers to get him maybe to play longer if he doesn't get hit as much. But I just thought going all in, bringing Rodgers as many weapons as he needed, I thought that was for sure going to be the move, but Brock Bowers continued to slide. The Broncos weren't going to take Brock Bowers at 12. They ended up taking Bo Nix, and before anybody else can try and trade up, the Colts were very interested in Brock Bowers. I'm sure if he went to 14 or even stuck at 13, I'm sure the Colts might have called the Las Vegas Raiders about making a trade. I'm sure of that just from the reports on the Colts being very interested in him. But the Las Vegas Raiders decided to ended up taking him at 13. And you look at Brock Bowers now, it really just shifts this idea. For me, in terms of the Raiders, I look at them, you look at the quarterback, that is really the main point of this entire thing. I just finished talking about the Browns and Deshaun Watson. If you don't have a quarterback or don't have somebody there playing to the level that they should, it's not really going to pan out for them at this point. And their general manager, Tom Telesco, mentioned that they had scouts tracking Brock Bowers for an extensive period of time. So by shifting your attention now to Brock Bowers, it's not like this was just a random selection of thinking, oh, Brock Bowers is there, let's just take him. They obviously did a lot of work on Brock Bowers. They had their scouts tracking him for a long time, as well as other prospects, like they do their due diligence throughout this whole draft process just to map out every likely outcome that they have. And this was rare. I can see it just because the Raiders last year drafted Michael Mayer, 35th overall last year. So it does make it a little bit unconventional, very rare for the Raiders to draft back-to-back tight ends so high. They actually became the first team in 50 years to draft tight ends that high since the Buffalo Bills did it in 1973. So this sort of thing, this sort of love for tight ends doesn't really happen as much. But as Tom Telesco, the Raiders general manager, implied during his press conference, that he tried to stick to the best player available approach. On top of that, Brock Bowers just adds another dimension to this offense. You want to talk about playmaking and just making a difference. Brock Bowers can surely make that happen for the Las Vegas Raiders. And there's always this topic or just conversation going around quarterbacks and how a quarterback can be great, but if you don't have the weapons around him, it could turn out very poorly, especially talking about a rookie or just any quarterback really in general. If you don't support him, the quarterback position, for how important it is, it's very reliant on the offensive line, the receivers, the running back, every other position. The quarterback is very reliant on all of that, and you could draft a very talented quarterback, and it would be hard for him to make the receivers look better than they are, because it works the other way around. You bring in Brock Bowers with Devontae Adams and Jacoby Myers. You have all of these talents around a Gardner Minshew or a Aiden O'Connell. With this level of talent, if Gardner Minshew and Aiden O'Connell can just not really mess up, honestly, and just be a game manager, like that phrase is thrown around a lot, they're going to look a lot better than they're advertised as if they have all these great options. Brock Bowers over the middle, Michael Mayer, Devontae Adams, and Jacoby Myers as well. They could look potentially a lot better than the kind of player that they are. You don't think of Aiden O'Connell as a top quarterback. Same goes with Gardner Minshew. He's been around a whole lot. You don't see these guys as solidified number one options at quarterback, but when you have all these all-stars around you, these great talents around you, it makes you look a lot better if all you have to do is just put it on target, not do too much, stick to the game plan, and get them the ball. It makes the Raiders look a lot better, makes the quarterback look a lot better, and in that mindset, in that strategy, I really like this move. You can't go wrong with adding a guy like Brock Bowers, and it still remains a long-term problem for the Raiders. You can't stick with them 5-6 years going on. But for right now, I think it was the best move for them to have Brock Bowers just fall in their lap like this. It still is a great pick in my estimation, and they have to figure out other spots as well. I would like them to add another defensive back to their team. But other than that, they addressed the running back room pretty well, offensive line and defensive line, by signing Christian Wilkins, Alexander Madison, and so forth. This just makes this whole offseason process a lot more solid than it did looking back a few months ago, when everybody was looking at the Raiders like they need a quarterback, they need this, they need that. Bringing in talented players, even if you didn't get a quarterback, I still think it makes you be able to improve this next year. No one expects this Raiders team to be game-changing, a whole different team, a 180-degree turn in 2024. But if you just get better with Antonio Pierce there, the players seem to like him, I think this could end up being a great solution for them long-term. And then just accepting not getting a top guy as a quarterback says a lot about really their maturity, willing to accept, what can we do? We missed out on a top quarterback. To have that confidence in their work, in Antonio Pierce, and in their project that they have building, I think says a lot about them, gives me more confidence if I'm a Raiders fan, if I'm really banking on this team. To have that level of confidence and maturity above all, to just accept it, that this is a marathon, not a sprint. I can fully 100% support that, and the Raiders are another team I'm looking forward to seeing how Brock Bowers fits into that offense. Devontae Adams now as well, trying to rebound from last year, building that team up from scratch with Antonio Pierce leading the way. I'm a big fan of Antonio Pierce and what they're doing in Las Vegas. Next year, the year after that, we can address the quarterback if it pans out that way, but a good overall selection for the Las Vegas Raiders. I think they made a good choice there, and looking forward to seeing them in 2024. But in the meantime, we're going to move on to the next segment. The last segment on today's show revolves around the Pittsburgh Steelers and their general manager, Omar Khan, finally addressing the rumors around the draft. There was a lot being said about the 49ers receivers especially. Find out and stick around to see what Omar Khan said on those topics on the last segment on today's show. Don't go anywhere. You're listening to the GSMC Chip Shot Football Podcast.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC. to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
Back here on today's show, on the last segment of today's episode. Before I jump fully into the last segment, I want to remind you guys one more time, if you have any comments or questions you want to make on today's show, to use the tip and donations link you see on your screen at gsmcpodcast.net. By using that tip and donations link, I can see your question or comment that you make during the live show, and I'm able to react to it and maybe get a different perspective on what we're talking about. It's always more engaging that way, and it's a massive help for the show on top of that. So if you would, please use the tip and donations link, gsmcpodcast.net, with any of your questions or comments. And in saying that, the last thing we can go on and talk about on today's episode is the Pittsburgh Steelers and their seemingly endless pursuit of another wide receiver. They've addressed a lot this offseason, offensive line, through the draft especially. They brought in guys like Quez Watkins, Van Jefferson on the offensive side of the ball, and they made a lot of changes. New offensive coordinator Arthur Smith, new wide receiver coach Zach Azzanni. They're really trying to embrace this new identity, trying to run the ball a lot. It seems like the mindset is trying to use as much as you can for Najee Harris and Jaylen Warren, really trying to run the ball a lot. I mentioned the offensive line. They addressed wide receiver also a little bit by bringing in Roman Wilson from Michigan in the third round of the draft as well. So they kind of picked and chosen a little bit from each position, but people still, I feel as well, that they still need something else on the offensive side, maybe somebody a bit more established, a bit more reliable than having to rely on so many rookies so early on. Because you still have your quarterbacks, Russell Wilson and Justin Fields as well, on essentially one-year deals. You want to do as much as you can to try and address that problem and get them to play their best ball this coming year. So this pursuit of the Steelers trying to get another wide receiver really starts and ends with, I would say, 3 guys, potentially 4 guys on the list. Courtland Sutton from the Broncos, Deebo Samuel, Brandon Ayuk, and Tyler Boyd, who is a free agent still currently. Recent reports have him meeting with the Tennessee Titans and the Los Angeles Chargers, so he seems like the furthest away from arriving in Pittsburgh, but Deebo, Brandon, and Courtland seem to be like the main names right now around the Steelers organization and just around the Steelers fan base on who they could potentially land. There was reports during the draft, I'm sure most people saw them, from the San Francisco Chronicle on the Pittsburgh Steelers, allegedly rejecting the 49ers offer, their high price that they had for Deebo Samuel. There was definitely interest there from the Steelers, as the report says, but they rejected it. They turned away from it because they just didn't see it as worth it to go out and get Deebo Samuel for that price. Then you had Brandon Ayuk earlier in the offseason be in trade talks because of his contract situation, tweeting at Mike Tomlin, funny enough, referencing how they look similar, which I thought was great. So you have those connections there. And now, more recently, were the Courtland Sutton talks about him not showing up to their voluntary camps because he's allegedly trying to get a better contract from the Denver Broncos. So he is sort of holding out a little bit, sort of a mini holdout to try and get that contract reworked, trying to get more guaranteed money. It makes sense if you're Courtland Sutton. You were by far and away the best wide receiver for the Denver Broncos. So to try and get a better contract, it makes sense. But you look at the Broncos team, talent-wise, and just in terms of salary cap as well, it could alleviate a lot of salary cap room for the Broncos if they decided to trade him away, or instead of giving him more money to stick around and potentially altering how you address the salary cap situation for that team, it is just more likely for them to trade him or try to find another solution to try and get him off their books a little bit and get some more breathing room, which is where the rumors and all the reports start coming up, because people look at that. The Broncos, I think it's fair to say that they aren't going anywhere anytime soon, really. As much as Bo Nix comes in and could potentially be the starter right away, it seems like they have just a lot of holes and are missing a lot of stuff on both sides of the ball. So having Courtland Sutton there, yeah, it's great because he's a number one receiver for you, but how much better is he really making your team if you don't have the pieces around him? That's one reason why I think if I had to choose who would end up on the Steelers out of all these players, I think would probably be Courtland Sutton because of those money reasons that I gave, but there's also connections with Courtland Sutton and some members of the Steelers. The first one being obviously Sutton and Russell Wilson playing together last year. They put up some pretty great numbers in fault of all the other pieces that might have been missing, all the behind-the-scenes issues. It seems like they developed a very good connection on the field, so that's one thing that could bring Courtland Sutton over to Pittsburgh. And you also have the connection with Pittsburgh's new wide receiver coach, Zach Azzani, was Courtland Sutton's wide receiver coach from 2018 to 2022. So two familiar faces on the Steelers roster already that could entice Courtland Sutton to be traded to the Pittsburgh Steelers. But it seems like it's close, but the general manager for the Pittsburgh Steelers, Omar Khan, appeared on the Pat McAfee show on Tuesday and sort of cleared everything up with this seemingly being close to happening. He came on there and said, "I heard about it. I didn't exactly see it, but there's nothing going on right now, so I'm not exactly sure what the verbiage was or what was reported, but there's nothing to report as of now." It became especially... what's the word I'm looking for? It became especially just very alert this week, especially with former Steelers and current CBS analyst Brian McFadden going on his show on CBS and saying that the Steelers were closing in on a significant playmaker earlier this week as well. So you have all the reports out there. You have a former player for the Steelers, Brian McFadden, saying to everybody, all the Steelers fans listening, or that will listen, that a playmaker is just on the verge there of coming in. And that just brings everybody in closer, just expecting something to break any time now. But Omar Khan hasn't really said that anything is close, like that quote read, but he went in a little bit deeper and expanded on his thoughts on the 102.5 WDVE radio station, in which he said, "There's nothing in the works right now, nothing close to happening. I can tell you conversations will continue, but there's nothing close to happening right now." And that is, I guess, a bit more alleviating if you're a Steelers fan, that it hasn't been completely ruled out. But, nothing seems to be moving right now. With all the talks and everything, it's just funny how all these rumors come out, but essentially, according to Omar Khan, the needle really hasn't moved a lot since the beginning of the draft, since the beginning of last month now in April. The Steelers are really taking their time with this. There are a lot of options out there, but just today I saw on my way over here that General Manager John Lynch for the 49ers has again ruled out trading Brandon Ayuk and Deebo Samuel, saying that his wide receiver room is as ideal as they would like. So with those two options now sort of fading away, you look at Tyler Boyd. He's sort of exploring other options in the Titans and the Los Angeles Chargers. And now that sort of leaves you with Courtland Sutton, which I have as my favored player that is brought in for the Pittsburgh Steelers. And I think it will end up happening. It just seems like this is too close to not happen in the end. With the connections, like I mentioned before, to Azzani and Russell Wilson, he will cost less than the others as well. If you're the Steelers and you're trying to make a decision, he'll cost definitely less than you're going to have to give up for Brandon Ayuk or Deebo. And Tyler Boyd, the main issue with him was that he was asking for a bit too much than what the Steelers were willing to pay, essentially a number 2 and a number 3 wide receiver. So, again, the Steelers are pretty stingy with what they give up. Just being a fan of them, I don't see any of those deals happening right now. Courtland Sutton seems like the most likely option, but with that being said, you have to ask a question now. What if you don't get anybody and you're left with Quez Watkins, Van Jefferson, George Pickens, Calvin Austin, and you bring in Roman Wilson, who I'm a big fan of, just watching him at Michigan. I believe he can be a number 2 receiver, maybe even a number 1 if he improves a lot and just adds on to the skill set that he already has. But in that belief, I do realize that it is realistic that he might not contribute right away a lot in his first year. So that's something that the Steelers have to consider with Omar Khan coming out and clarifying these trade talks. Nothing is happening right now, but, you don't want to take too long on this situation and just sit on your options and hope that something out there comes up and miss out on potentially all of them. And then this whole offseason that you've addressed so many great positions, you brought in so much great talent, you don't want that to go to waste per se, for a lack of a better term, just because you didn't go out and really aggressively pursue another playmaker to make this team even better. They've done a lot on both sides of the ball, like I mentioned, through the draft. Patrick Queen, bringing in 2 quarterbacks to really flip that quarterback room on its head. I think now to stop short of really addressing everything would be a little bit disappointing, just looking at the Steelers' offense, but I see them going out there and making a move. I think it's going to be Courtland Sutton from what I've read and from what I've looked into, but let me know what you guys think in the comments or in the chat box as well. Do you think the Steelers will end up getting Courtland Sutton? Maybe get somebody else completely different that I didn't mention on here? Leave all your thoughts. I'm very interested to know what any of you guys or all of you guys think on the Steelers wide receiver options in the rest of the offseason. But that's all of what Omar Khan said on those topics, and that will close out this episode for us. I want to thank you guys for tuning in to today's episode of the GSMC Chip Shot Football Podcast. Please remember to like, follow, and subscribe to the show, as well as following the network on Facebook, Instagram, X, and TikTok for more of the network's content outside of sports as well. And if you want to see more of me and this show, check out the GSMC Sports Network channel and the Podcast Network channel, where YouTube shorts are posted on every weekday. You have the full live recorded shows all on there as well if you missed one and want to go rewatch a whole show, as well as individual segment videos that are taken from the live shows in case you missed one part of a show, or if you just want to rewatch a specific part. They're all on there on both channels as well. Tune in every weekday at 6:30 p.m. Eastern Time for more NFL conversations and football discussions with me, Manny Maradiaga, as your host. Thanking you guys again for tuning in, and I hope to see you guys all back here again tomorrow to close out yet another week.
Let's go. I wake up to a little bit of drool on my pillow, feel like it's gonna be a bad day. Yeah, I'm tired of shit, and the coffee ain't hit yet, damn, ain't that